If no one in this room understands me, then my son dies in silence, the Japanese billionaire said, and the entire Manhattan restaurant froze without even realizing why those words carried panic. Crystal chandeliers reflected off polished marble as executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending to understand the urgency while the translator in front of them hesitated, searching for words that no longer felt reliable. William Carter, the American CEO hosting the meeting, leaned forward with a controlled breath, his steel-gray eyes narrowing as the contract worth over $3 billion suddenly felt heavier than the table it rested on. Across from him, Kenji Takahashi sat rigid, his phone showing a hospital notification from Tokyo General Medical Center, where his 7-year-old son was awaiting emergency approval for a treatment window that would close in less than 2 hours. Every second of delay outside that hospital meant irreversible consequences. But in this room, language had become a locked door no one could open. The interpreter cleared his throat, attempted a correction, then faltered again, misaligning the urgency of Kenji's words into something soft and meaningless. And the Japanese billionaire's expression hardened with quiet desperation. William exhaled sharply, tapping his finger once against the table as he scanned the room, realizing that power meant nothing when communication collapsed. Around them, assistants whispered, executives glanced at each other, and no one moved to fix the situation because no one wanted to admit they were lost. That was when Ava Johnson, a shy black waitress moving silently between tables with practiced precision, paused near the edge of the meeting circle. She wasn't supposed to be part of anything like this, just another server in a high-end Manhattan restaurant where people like her were expected to remain invisible. But her eyes lingered on Kenji's tense posture, on the trembling frustration in his voice, and something subtle shifted in her expression, as if she had already understood more than she was supposed to. William noticed her presence and frowned slightly, gesturing for her to step back. But before he could speak, Ava calmly placed a glass of water on the table and said in fluent Japanese, "He is not refusing the agreement. He is asking why his son's medical approval has not been prioritized yet." The room did not react immediately because their minds needed time to accept what their ears had heard. Kenji's head snapped toward her, his eyes widening in disbelief as silence expanded like a shockwave through the restaurant. William slowly turned his gaze upward, studying Ava for the first time not as staff, but as something entirely unexpected. "You speak Japanese?" he asked, his voice lower now, no longer commanding but questioning. Ava hesitated for only a second, her hands still steady, her voice soft but certain as she replied, "I studied in Tokyo for 3 years, before I came back." And in that brief moment, while the billionaire across from her stared as if the world had shifted without warning, William Carter realized something unsettling. This waitress had understood the situation faster than anyone in the room who was actually paid to understand it, and yet no one had ever bothered to ask who she really was. The silence that followed did not break. It expanded, stretching across the entire restaurant as if the air itself had become heavier. Kenji Takahashi slowly turned his head toward Ava Johnson, his expression caught between disbelief and fragile hope, as though hearing his own language spoken by a stranger had forced reality to shift under his feet. William Carter remained still, his eyes fixed on Ava with a controlled intensity that did not belong to confusion anymore but to calculation, the kind of stare he used when something valuable revealed itself without warning. Around them, the executives who had been moments ago confident in their roles now shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the conversation had moved beyond their understanding. The translator lowered his gaze, aware that his authority in the room had been replaced in a single sentence. Kenji spoke again, slower this time, his voice carrying urgency as he repeated something about his son, about medical approval forms in Tokyo that required immediate confirmation. But the tension in his tone made it clear that time was no longer an abstract concern but a collapsing structure. Ava listened without interruption, her posture calm but her eyes sharper now, as if she was mentally reconstructing every fragment of what had been said before she entered the circle. William finally spoke, his tone controlled but no longer dismissive, asking her how she could possibly understand not just the language but the context of a conversation that even trained professionals had failed to manage. Ava hesitated, then explained softly that she had worked in Tokyo General Medical Center years ago, assisting international patients and translating urgent medical documentation during her studies, not as a formal employee but as part of a scholarship program that required real-world service. The words changed the atmosphere again, because suddenly she was no longer an invisible waitress but someone who had been present in environments where every word carried consequence. Kenji leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering as he asked her if she understood what he had just said about his son, and Ava answered carefully, confirming that she did, then clarified the missing nuance that the translator had failed to capture, explaining that the request was not a refusal of cooperation but a demand for immediate prioritization based on medical urgency protocols. William's expression tightened, not out of anger but recognition, because he realized the entire negotiation had been destabilized not by disagreement but by misunderstanding. He glanced at the translator, then back at Ava, and asked why someone with her skill set was working as a waitress in a restaurant instead of in a professional capacity where language like that mattered. The question lingered in the air longer than expected, and Ava's answer came quietly, stating that life had not followed the path she had prepared for, and responsibilities outside her control had forced her to step away from her previous work. Kenji closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing both relief and frustration at once, then spoke again in Japanese, this time directing his words toward Ava with urgency, asking her if she could help ensure his message reached the hospital correctly before the approval window closed. William watched her closely, sensing that whatever happened next would determine more than just the success of a business deal, because in front of him stood someone who had entered the room unnoticed and was now holding the only clear line of communication left between a father and his son across the world. Kenji Takahashi leaned forward, his voice now more urgent as he repeated the medical details in careful Japanese, each word carrying the weight of a father counting down time he could not afford to lose. Ava Johnson listened without interruption, her focus absolute, and for the first time the room stopped seeing her as a waitress and started seeing her as a bridge between collapse and resolution. William Carter remained standing slightly behind the table, his arms no longer folded, his posture shifted into something more alert, as if every sentence now mattered in a way that extended beyond business. Ava closed her eyes briefly, translating not just words but intent, then spoke clearly in English so everyone could understand, explaining that Kenji's son was in a critical approval window for a specialized neurological procedure in Tokyo General Medical Center, and that any delay in authorization from the contract side would directly affect hospital scheduling priority. The translator tried to interject, but William raised a hand, stopping him without looking away from Ava. There was something unsettlingly precise about the way she processed information, as if she was not translating in real time but reconstructing meaning from memory and experience. Kenji's hands tightened slightly as he asked Ava if the hospital had confirmed the timing window, and she answered without hesitation that the approval window was exactly 1 hour and 42 minutes remaining, a detail she had inferred from the phrasing and urgency embedded in his earlier statements. A subtle shift moved through the room, because no one had mentioned an exact time frame aloud, and yet she had identified it correctly. William stepped closer to the table now, his voice lower as he asked Ava how she could be so certain, and she explained calmly that in Tokyo medical systems, authorization language often includes coded urgency markers tied to procedural windows, something she had learned during her time assisting international cases. Kenji exhaled slowly, relief and disbelief mixing in his expression as he realized someone finally understood him without distortion. He spoke again in Japanese, this time softer, asking Ava to confirm whether his request was being understood as refusal or delay, and Ava immediately clarified that it was neither, but a conditional hold requiring verification from the hospital before final signature acknowledgement. William looked at her differently now, no longer as an unexpected presence but as an essential factor in a situation spiraling beyond his control. He asked her directly why she had not been working in a field where this level of linguistic and contextual expertise was being used properly, and Ava's gaze dropped for a moment before she replied that life circumstances had forced her to step away from international work, that she had taken whatever employment allowed stability without requiring relocation or long commitments. The honesty in her voice shifted the tone again, grounding the room in something human beneath the pressure of contracts and timelines. Kenji nodded slowly, then asked her if she could help him send a precise message to the hospital that would prevent misinterpretation, and Ava agreed without hesitation, stepping slightly closer to the table as she began translating his words into structured formal Japanese, suitable for medical authorization channels. William watched as she worked, realizing that the entire outcome of a multi-billion-dollar agreement was now being shaped not in boardroom negotiation tactics but in the quiet precision of a woman everyone had previously overlooked, and for the first time that evening, he began to wonder what else about her story had gone unseen. The message Ava Johnson was preparing to send carried more weight than anything spoken in the room that evening, because every word she shaped in Japanese was no longer just translation, but a direct line between a father and a hospital that could decide the fate of a child's treatment window. Kenji Takahashi stood silently now, watching her with a mixture of hope and fear as she carefully structured his request into formal medical language, her voice steady, precise, and stripped of any ambiguity that could cause delay or rejection. William Carter remained close enough to observe, his attention no longer on the contract on the table, but on the woman who had disrupted the balance of power in a room designed to exclude uncertainty. Around them, the executives had stopped whispering, realizing that the negotiation had shifted into something they did not control. Ava finished the translation and paused, then confirmed aloud that the message was ready to be sent through the hospital authorization channel, emphasizing the urgency in a way that aligned with Tokyo General Medical Center's protocol for emergency pediatric neurological approvals. Kenji immediately asked her to proceed, his voice tense but controlled, and Ava took the phone interface provided by his assistant, typing carefully as she transmitted the message across international systems that suddenly felt fragile and immediate. For a moment, nothing happened, and the silence in the restaurant became heavier than before, as if even the air was waiting for a response from across the world. William glanced at his watch, calculating not only business timelines but now medical ones, realizing that the remaining hour and 40 minutes were no longer abstract but narrowing into something irreversible. Then Ava's phone lit up with an incoming response, and she read it without expression at first, then translated it aloud for Kenji and the room. The hospital had acknowledged receipt of the clarification and confirmed that the authorization window was still open, but required final digital confirmation from the contract side within the hour to prioritize scheduling. Kenji closed his eyes briefly, exhaling as if the weight on his chest had shifted but not disappeared, and William immediately turned to his legal advisor, instructing him to prepare the confirmation clause without delay. But before the movement could begin, Ava spoke again softly, pointing out a critical detail in the hospital's phrasing that suggested a secondary condition had been overlooked, one that required explicit acknowledgement of liability waiver language or the approval would remain pending even if the initial authorization was accepted. The room tightened again as William realized that what seemed like a resolution still contained a hidden barrier, and he asked Ava how she had noticed something his own legal team had missed. She replied simply that in Japanese medical contracts, omission of specific phrasing often indicated procedural dependency rather than optional wording, a nuance that was rarely translated correctly in international negotiations. Kenji looked at her with growing respect, then spoke quietly in Japanese, asking if she would continue to assist until everything was fully confirmed, and Ava nodded without hesitation. William studied her in silence for a long moment, then made a decision that shifted the direction of the entire meeting, instructing his team to temporarily suspend the business negotiation until the medical authorization was fully secured, a choice that surprised even his closest advisors. The executives reacted with visible uncertainty, but William's attention did not move from Ava, because he now understood that the success of the contract, the hospital approval, and even Kenji's trust all depended on a person who had entered the room unnoticed and was now standing at the center of everything that mattered. The restaurant no longer felt like a place built for dining, but like a suspended space where every second carried consequences that stretched far beyond Manhattan. Ava Johnson stood at the center of it all, her focus locked on the hospital confirmation process still unfolding on Kenji Takahashi's phone, while William Carter remained unusually still beside her, watching how effortlessly she navigated between languages, systems, and urgency without raising her voice or demanding attention. Kenji spoke again in Japanese, this time more controlled but still tense, asking whether the secondary clause Ava had identified could be resolved quickly enough to prevent any further delay, and Ava translated the question into precise English for William before answering Kenji directly that it depended entirely on how quickly the legal confirmation could be submitted with correct phrasing. William immediately turned to his legal advisor and instructed him to prioritize the exact wording Ava had outlined, emphasizing that there would be no deviation from the hospital protocol she had identified. The advisor hesitated for a fraction of a second, visibly unsettled that a waitress was now dictating contractual precision for a multi-billion-dollar agreement. But William's expression left no room for argument. Ava continued standing calmly, her attention shifting briefly to Kenji as she reassured him in Japanese that the process was now aligned with hospital requirements, and that the likelihood of approval had increased significantly if no further miscommunication occurred. Kenji lowered his head slightly in gratitude, his tension easing just enough to reveal exhaustion that had been held back for hours. Around them, the executives remained silent, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet recognition that control had shifted away from their structure and into something far less predictable. William finally broke his silence, asking Ava directly where she had learned to operate at this level of precision, not just linguistically but procedurally, because what she was doing went beyond translation and into systems understanding. Ava paused, then explained that during her time in Tokyo General Medical Center she had been required to assist in emergency coordination between foreign patients and hospital administration, often interpreting not just language but procedural intent under strict time constraints. William absorbed this without interruption, then asked why someone with that experience would be working in a restaurant instead of an international institution, and Ava's gaze lowered briefly before she answered that circumstances outside of her control had forced her to leave that path, and that stability had become more important than recognition. Kenji, listening closely, spoke again in Japanese, asking if she would remain present until the final. Confirmation was received, and Ava nodded, acknowledging that she would stay until everything was fully resolved. The legal team finally submitted the corrected clause exactly as she had instructed, and a moment of stillness followed as the system processed the update across international channels. William checked his watch again, noting that less than an hour remained in the critical window, and for the first time since the meeting began, he realized that success no longer depended on negotiation skill or financial leverage, but on whether one overlooked individual could continue holding together a chain of communication that had already nearly collapsed once. He looked at Ava again, seeing not a waitress, not an assistant, but the only reason the conversation between two worlds was still intact, and in that quiet realization, the entire balance of the evening shifted permanently. The confirmation process moved through the system in real time, each second tightening the invisible thread connecting Tokyo General Medical Center and the Manhattan restaurant. While Ava Johnson remained still at the center of it all, her attention divided only by necessity between Kenji Takahashi's quiet urgency and the legal verification unfolding through William Carter's team. Kenji spoke softly again in Japanese, asking whether any final obstacles remained, and Ava translated and responded with careful precision, confirming that the corrected clause had been accepted for processing and was now awaiting final hospital acknowledgement. William stood slightly behind her, his presence no longer dominant but observant, as if he had stepped out of his own authority to watch how authority functioned when it was stripped down to clarity and timing. The executives around the table exchanged uncertain glances, aware that the deal they had spent months constructing was now orbiting a single fragile condition that depended entirely on hospital confirmation arriving before the expiration window closed. Ava checked the phone again as a new message appeared, her expression tightening for the first time that evening, and she immediately translated aloud that the hospital had received the updated contract language but required one final identity verification from Kenji's medical file before releasing the priority scheduling approval. A subtle wave of tension moved through the room again, because even with everything correctly aligned, a single missing verification could still reset the entire process. Kenji immediately provided the requested identification details in Japanese, his voice steady but underscored with exhaustion, and Ava entered the information carefully, ensuring that every character matched the hospital's registered format. William watched her hands as she worked, noticing the lack of hesitation, the absence of uncertainty, and the quiet authority she carried even in something as simple as data entry that had become critical to a multimillion-dollar medical authorization chain. Moments passed without response, and the silence became almost physical, stretching across the table until even the executives stopped shifting in their seats. Ava exhaled softly, then translated a new incoming message from Tokyo confirming that the verification had been accepted and that the medical team was now proceeding with immediate scheduling priority for Kenji's son. For the first time, Kenji's shoulders visibly relaxed, his head lowering slightly as relief replaced the tension he had carried since entering the restaurant. William did not speak immediately, watching the shift in Kenji's expression before turning his gaze to Ava, as if recalibrating his understanding of what had just happened. The deal was still technically in progress, but the urgency that had threatened to collapse it had been resolved not through negotiation, but through precise interpretation of systems that no one else in the room had fully understood. One of the executives finally broke the silence, asking cautiously whether they could now resume the contractual discussion. But William raised a hand again, signaling patience, his focus still fixed on Ava. Kenji spoke quietly in Japanese, thanking Ava directly, his tone sincere and heavy with gratitude that extended beyond language itself, and Ava responded with a slight nod, acknowledging his words without drawing attention to herself. William finally spoke, his voice measured as he asked Ava if she had ever considered how valuable her skill set truly was in environments beyond where she currently worked, and Ava paused, her expression briefly distant as if the question carried weight beyond the room. She answered calmly that she had once worked in places where those skills were essential every day, but life had redirected her path in ways that left little room for professional recognition. William studied her in silence for a moment longer, then turned slightly toward his team, instructing them to proceed with finalizing the business agreement while he made a separate note to himself that what had just occurred was not an anomaly but a discovery that would require further attention. In that moment, the restaurant no longer felt like a meeting space between corporations, but like a point where unseen abilities had quietly reshaped the outcome of everything that had nearly been lost. The final confirmation from Tokyo General Medical Center arrived without warning, appearing on Ava Johnson's screen as a structured approval notice that immediately changed the energy inside the Manhattan restaurant, because the fragile chain of communication that had been holding for the past hour had finally solidified into something permanent. Kenji Takahashi read the translated message through Ava's voice, his shoulders dropping in visible relief as the hospital confirmed that his son had been officially placed into priority scheduling for the critical procedure, with no further delays expected within the approved window. For a brief moment, no one in the room spoke, as if the weight of the entire negotiation, the medical urgency, and the emotional tension had all collapsed into silence that no one knew how to break. William Carter exhaled slowly, finally straightening his posture, his eyes still fixed on Ava, not as a waitress, not as an accidental participant, but as the central reason a situation that should have failed had instead resolved. One of the executives attempted to restart the conversation about finalizing the business agreement, but William did not immediately respond, instead turning slightly toward Kenji and acknowledging the success of the medical outcome first, stating that the contract could wait until the human priority had been fully secured. Kenji bowed his head slightly in gratitude, speaking in Japanese with a tone that carried both relief and respect, and Ava translated it softly, confirming that he was expressing appreciation not only for the hospital coordination but for the unexpected clarity that had allowed communication to succeed without error. William finally shifted his attention back to the table, instructing his legal team to proceed with the final execution of the agreement, but his tone had changed, no longer purely transactional, because something about the evening had permanently altered his perception of how fragile high-level systems could be when communication broke down. Ava stood quietly beside the table, no longer actively translating, her role in the immediate crisis complete, yet her presence still drawing attention in a way that none of the executives could ignore. Kenji looked at her once more, speaking softly in Japanese to thank her personally, and Ava responded with a simple acknowledgement, maintaining her calm demeanor as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, even though she had effectively prevented a medical authorization failure that could have impacted a child's treatment timeline across continents. William watched this exchange carefully, then asked Ava one final question, his voice lower now, asking if she understood what had just happened beyond the language barrier, if she realized that without her intervention both the contract and the medical approval might have collapsed simultaneously. Ava hesitated for a moment, then replied that she only acted on what she understood in the moment, not expecting any outcome beyond resolving confusion. That answer lingered in the air longer than anything else said that evening, because it revealed not ambition, not strategy, but instinctive competence operating without recognition. Kenji slowly gathered his belongings, still visibly affected by the emotional release of receiving confirmation from the hospital, and before leaving, he spoke one last sentence in Japanese directed toward Ava, which she translated as a quiet acknowledgement that her presence had changed the outcome of his son's future. William did not stop him as Kenji left the table, but his attention remained on Ava, and for the first time since the meeting began, he seemed to be evaluating not the deal itself, but the person who had silently redirected its outcome. As the room began to settle and the executives returned to their documents, William made a quiet internal decision that whatever Ava Johnson was, she was no longer someone to be overlooked, and in the calm aftermath of a crisis resolved too precisely to be ignored, the evening ended with an unspoken realization that something far larger than a business agreement had just been revealed. The restaurant had shifted into a calmer rhythm, but the emotional aftershock of what had just happened still lingered in the air, like a quiet vibration that no one could fully ignore. Ava Johnson stood slightly apart from the table now, her role in the immediate crisis complete, yet William Carter's attention continued to return to her in intervals that grew more frequent, as if his mind refused to categorize her as simply staff or coincidence. The executives resumed their positions around the table, attempting to reestablish the structure of the business discussion, but the tone had permanently changed, no longer driven by urgency alone but by an underlying awareness that the outcome had been influenced by someone outside their assumed system of importance. Kenji Takahashi had already left with his assistant, carrying confirmation of his son's medical approval, but the impact of that resolution remained present in the room, shaping how every remaining sentence was spoken. William finally closed the folder containing the contract draft, signaling a temporary pause in the negotiation, and the room responded with quiet acknowledgement. He then turned his attention fully toward Ava, asking her to remain for a moment longer, his voice measured but no longer purely professional. Ava paused, then approached the table with calm uncertainty, her posture unchanged, but her awareness clearly attuned to the shift in focus. William studied her for a moment before speaking, asking her directly if she understood how rare it was for someone outside a formal system to intervene so precisely in both linguistic and procedural breakdowns under pressure. Ava replied that she had only responded to what she saw needed correction, without considering broader implications. That answer created a silence that felt heavier than any negotiation delay, because it revealed a mindset that did not align with the structures surrounding her. One of the executives quietly suggested resuming the contract approval immediately, but William raised his hand, signaling that the evening was no longer about urgency or completion. Instead, he stated that what had occurred required reassessment, not of the deal, but of the environment in which decisions like this were made without recognizing critical contributors. Ava looked slightly uncomfortable as attention remained fixed on her, and William noticed it, lowering his tone as he asked where she was currently employed and whether she had considered roles that matched her demonstrated capabilities. Ava answered honestly that she worked wherever stability allowed, and that her previous experience had not translated into opportunities she could maintain. William nodded slowly, absorbing this without interruption, then made a quiet statement that she should not be overlooked again in systems that depended on accuracy and interpretation at this level. The executives exchanged brief glances, uncertain how to categorize what they were witnessing, because this was no longer a business adjustment, but a reassessment of value itself. Ava stepped back slightly, as if preparing to return to her duties, but William stopped her with a final question, asking if she would be willing to remain available in case any follow-up clarification was needed from Tokyo General Medical Center. Ava agreed calmly, acknowledging that she would assist if required, then returned to her position near the edge of the room. As the executives resumed final procedural steps to formally close the contract, William remained still for a moment longer, watching Ava with a level of focus that suggested the evening had shifted from completion of a deal to the beginning of something he had not anticipated, because for the first time, he was not evaluating success based on agreement terms, but on the unseen person who had silently ensured none of it collapsed. The final steps of the evening unfolded in a quieter rhythm, as the formal structure of the contract was completed and the executives began organizing their documents with a sense of resolution that felt almost distant compared to the tension that had defined the previous hour. William Carter remained seated for a moment longer after the signatures were prepared, his attention not on the papers but on Ava Johnson, who stood near the edge of the room as if she belonged neither to the negotiation nor entirely outside of it. Kenji Takahashi had already left the restaurant, but his presence lingered in the form of confirmed medical authorization and a successfully completed approval process that had depended entirely on precise communication. William finally closed the folder and instructed his team to finalize internal filing, signaling that the corporate portion of the evening was officially complete. The executives began to rise, exchanging brief acknowledgments, but William did not move immediately. Instead, he looked toward Ava and asked her to step closer once more, his tone now softer, less structured than before. Ava complied, approaching the table with quiet caution, her expression neutral but attentive. William studied her for a long moment before speaking, stating that what had occurred earlier was not something that could be dismissed as coincidence or temporary assistance, because she had directly influenced outcomes in both medical and contractual systems under extreme time pressure. Ava responded calmly that she had only acted to correct misunderstandings when she recognized them, without anticipating any broader consequence. William nodded slowly, acknowledging her answer but not accepting it as complete, then asked if she had ever considered how her ability to operate in multilingual and procedural environments could be applied in a formal capacity beyond her current work. Ava hesitated briefly, then replied that stability and personal responsibility had taken priority over pursuing specialized roles, and that her circumstances had not allowed her to remain in international environments. William absorbed this without interruption, his expression tightening slightly as he processed the gap between her capability and her current position. After a moment, he stated that it would be a mistake for systems that rely on precision to continue overlooking someone like her, and that he would like his organization to remain in contact in case future coordination or interpretation was required. Ava acknowledged the offer politely, maintaining her reserved demeanor, then stepped back as the final documents were secured. As the last of the executives left the room, William remained behind briefly, watching her return to her position with the same quiet efficiency she had shown throughout the evening. The restaurant had returned to its normal atmosphere, but the meaning of what had happened within it had shifted permanently. William finally stood, preparing to leave, but before doing so, he looked once more at Ava and realized that the outcome of the evening was no longer defined by the contract that had been signed, but by the discovery of someone whose presence had altered the trajectory of events without seeking recognition. In that quiet realization, the night ended not with closure, but with the beginning of a question William Carter could not ignore.